Well, dear friends, both here and online, it is, as always, an enormous privilege and pleasure to have a few moments with you. I am a committed world federalist, which means that I believe, and all those in the World Federalist movement believe, that we want to see a better democratic global governance of our human, physical, and environmental resources. That is an object, and because it's federalist, it means looking at subsidiarity, where you have governance at the lowest level possible for that to be effective, and you reserve upwards only those issues which transcend those local barriers and actually need to be resolved at a national or a global level. And never has there been a greater need for that than what we are living through today. Those three, what really inspires me about the Universal Peace Federation is its universality. When you've seen the presentations that we've had, and you realise that UPF has a structure and a message for every aspect of human life, whether it is political, philosophical, professional, religious, cultural, family. There are others as well. But it pervades all those issues. And that's what's so exciting about it, because when you think about it, that is an enormous power to harness for the realization of a better managed and governed world, which is what we seek. And so there is tremendous capacity there, and I think all of us it's incumbent on us to try to make sure that we use that power, that influence, in a highly beneficial way. I want to just look briefly at those three values which were pinned up a moment ago: interdependence, prosperity, shared values. Well, they are under challenge today more than in very many people's lifetimes, and certainly since the days of the Cold War, where we had that uneasy peace based upon that obscenity of mutual assured destruction. In other words, the only reason the peace was maintained was out of terror that the other side might actually use nuclear weapons, and that the response to that would be immediate, and so therefore nobody would survive. It's not really a very firm foundation for peace, is it? We need to have peace based upon much more mutual understanding, mutual respect, the shared values. And yet what we see today is the horrific prospect of how one man, and it is one man, because I don't believe the war in Ukraine is a war between the Ukrainians and the Russian people. It's a war between the Ukrainians and one man who's achieved autocratic rule, surrounded himself by people who will not deny him anything or challenge his views, and has only become now so isolated. And whether there is a health reason behind that or not, I don't know. There's a lot of speculation about that. We've only got to see the way he now grips the table. And that's at the end of a very long one, with disconsolate generals sitting at the other end. But the true horror and the reason that underpins this whole concept of getting a better managed world is that one person can now throw the whole world into devastation. Because it's not just the bereavement, the death, and the horror that's happening in Ukraine. It is a fact that Ukraine is the breadbasket not just of Europe, but of a large part of the world. A large part of the wheat that is consumed in Africa and other parts of the world, let alone Europe, comes from Ukraine. The harvest, on top of Nina, the environmental catastrophe as well, means that this year it probably won't yield anything like it has in the past. That in itself is potentially condemning already impoverished people in Africa to starvation and to a humanitarian crisis, the like of which this world has seldom seen for a very long time. It's almost a kind of replication of what Stalin and Mao did in their respective countries, with a great leap forward and the terrible tragedies of the war against the kulaks in the 1930s in what was then Soviet Russia. And all that could happen on top of the energy crisis, where, as we all know, these figures are now becoming embedded in our mind. 40% of Europe's energy needs comes from Russia. We have allowed ourselves to become dependent on one particular country for that source of energy, no doubt very much encouraged by Putin, because, of course, he saw that as a way of trying to exercise control. But the result of that is far more far-reaching than just the issues I've mentioned. It means that reach towards globalization, where there was far greater freedom of trade and movement of goods, people had long supply lines, they looked for the sourcing of the cheapest and the best materials, so that kept the cost of living down. All that has now been destroyed, as both in terms of provision of energy and supplies and goods, people are now shrinking those supply lines. It's not just the pandemic and the disruption to global cargo trade on shipping and things like this, but this in itself means that people are now sourcing those things far closer to home. That's going to cost more. It's going to cost you and me more. It's going to cost everybody in the world more. It's also meaning that there's a rebirth of narrow nationalism as everybody looks to their own national resources rather than having a wider understanding of global trade. So there are really very big issues at stake here. And we must use that power and influence that I mentioned of the Universal Peace Federation to try to bring back people to that understanding that there is another way. There is a better way. We do not have to rely on narrow nationalism. We do not have to relive the horrors of the last century. We should be able to learn some lessons from history, which of course never fully repeats itself, but very often has chilling reminiscences when you look back at what happened in the lead up to the Second World War. So I'm sorry, it's rather a grim message, but it's one I think that should empower and reinforce us and actually give us great source of strength to know that we have got a message which is of relevance, that can give hope to those who don't want to live in the kind of world that we're seeing develop right now, who can go back to saying, yes, there can be peace between religions. Yes, there can be peace between nations. And you mentioned, Jerusalem. Many of you will have been to Jerusalem. I've had the pleasure and privilege of being there. And you know what struck me as we walked up the Via Dolorosa, behind Christians carrying the cross, the Orthodox Jews were coming down the road in the other direction at the same time as the Muezzin was calling the faithful to prayer. And I thought, isn't this just incredible? Here are three religions, yes, Abrahamic religions, so a common theme, but three religions, which have been at great enmity with one another, and yet somehow being able to live in harmony in a place which has seen a lot of its own violence and conflict. It can be done. It can be achieved. But what it needs is for people to be reminded constantly, daily, that there is another way. That, my friends, I believe is the message that we must promote. Thank you very much. Thank you.